Hi, my name is Brando, and this is Comics Context, where I'm going to talk about something very near and dear to my heart, comics. Comics have always been a huge part of my life as long as I can remember, and comics have been there and grown up with me. As the title implies, I want to give some context to comics. I want to talk about the amazing things that comics can and have done, and what better place to start than the beginning. So today I wanted to give a brief overview of where comics came from, and how they've gotten where they are today. Short disclaimer though, this is a huge, and I mean massively huge subject, and there's no way I'll be able to cover everything in one short video. Now that's a good question. The definition of what comics are is something that's a large debate among those who are invested in them. If you ask anyone what comics are, I'm sure you'll get a myriad of different answers. It's hard to define something that's as adaptive and as versatile as comics are. Will Eisner once simply defined comics as sequential art. And hell, I'd say that's a pretty good starting point. Comics are art that shows the passage of time, whether it be through one image or multiple. But it's grown to be known for panels, gutters, speech bubbles, text boxes, sound effects, and a whole slew of other stuff. But where did it start? It's hard to place exactly where comics began. Some would argue that it started in ancient forms of sequential narrative, such as Trajan's column in Rome or the Bayeux Tapestry. While I do agree that these are some of the most basic roots for what comics would become, I'd like to place some of the earliest examples of what could be seen modernly as comics, with two men working at almost the same time across the world from each other. A Japanese artist named Kaozu Hokusai, who would become famous for his woodblock prints, most notably the Great Wave of Kanagawa. Hokusai would create a series of books called manga. While these were collections of sketches and not directly related to narrative-driven contemporary manga, there would be some evidence of paneling and sequence-driven work in his collection. Over in Europe, a Swiss artist by the name of Rudolf Taufer would go on to create illustrated books. These would become known as the first comics, and I can see why. Taufer's works includes most of what we commonly know today as comics, words and images working together to tell a narrative. Taufer's illustrated books included panels and text boxes. While the word balloon would not show up yet, Taufer would also directly cause the birth of American comics. In 1842 with the translation of his work, The Adventures of Obadiah Oldbuck, which would go on to be known as the first American comic book. Taufer's work would cause an interest in comics that would start their rise in America and the world. In 1895, a comic strip by the artist Richard Colt would be published, Hogan's Alley, which would be one of the first Sunday supplement comic strips in American newspapers. Hogan's Alley would also be one of the first comics to include the all-important word balloon, which would follow comics for the rest of their lifetime. Interestingly enough though, in a comic where word balloons were first implemented, there was a character that never used them. Mickey Dugan, better known as the Yellow Kid, wore an oversized yellow nightgown, which his dialogue was written on. Hogan's Alley would eventually be renamed the Yellow Kid after this character. And with Hogan's Alley, we finally got all the required parts to make a modern comic. But that's just the beginning of where comics are and where they're going. But by now you must be asking yourself, what about the superheroes? That's what comics are, right, Brando? Well, not entirely, but they are an important part of comic history. So now let's take a look at the rise of the superhero and how that's become synonymous with comics. While there can be some argument made over what constitutes a superhero, one character probably comes right to mind when you hear that word. It's even in his name. That's right, Superman. And for good reason. In many different ways, Superman set up the standard for what we know as superheroes today. In 1938, Superman made his big debut in Action Comics #1, created by the duo of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Superman was a larger-than-life hero with great powers that could outdo any normal human, and a secret identity to help him blend in among the people. Traits that would carry on to most superheroes that followed. The creation of Superman would lead to a boom of superhero comics in the industry. New heroes of all shapes and sizes would soon start flooding the newsstands. And this was the time many heroes you know of today were born, such as the Shadow, the Phantom, Batman, Wonder Woman, and Plastic Man, the Human Torch, and Namor the Submariner. They were all brought to life in comics during this time. Superheroes made it onto the comic scene in a big way. That is not to say that superheroes were the only things on the newsstands in comic form. There were many other stories for comics fans out there, and none were more popular than the crime and horror comics. While there are many companies exploring these genres, none stands out more than Effort Comics, more commonly known as EC. They would become known for many different series such as Frontline Combat, Weird Science, and Two-Fisted Tales, and others, but none stood out more than EC's horror line. Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear. While EC wasn't the only company publishing these types of stories, they were certainly one of the most successful. These books would gain much attention in the public eye. With the wide popularity of these comics that were over the top, violent, sexual, and terrifying sometimes, it wasn't long before someone took notice. That someone would be Dr. Frederick Wertheim, a psychiatrist who was widely invested in child psychology and what caused children to become delinquent. One common thread he found in delinquent children was that they were comic book readers. In 1954, he would write a book called Seduction of the Innocent, which made it apparent to many people for the first time the sometimes disturbing content of these comics. This book would lead to congressional hearings and inquiry about the comics industry. These hearings would lead to the creation of the Comics Code Authority, which would help self-regulate the content of comics. The Comics Code would create a huge effect on the crime and horror genres, and many companies, including EC, would shut down due to lack of distribution to the newsstands. While the introduction of the code would hamper many other genres of comics, the superhero book would simply adapt and change to these new regulations, keeping them alive for these times. While superhero comics have a huge history of their own that would take weeks just to begin to cover, the Comics Code would be one of the most major events that would lead to superheroes having one of the largest influences on comics. That's not to say that there weren't other genres and ideas in comics, but the one that would always stand the test of time is the superhero, leading to companies like Marvel and DC becoming huge and even having more mainstream outbreak such as TV series and movies. Superheroes have made their claim on the American comics market, but there would be other movements that would push comics in new, different directions. With the Comics Code having a sway on mainstream publishing and distribution, there started a new movement in comics and storytelling, the underground comic movement. The underground found their footings on the new age ideas of the hippie movement. This movement of comics was heavily based on self-publishing and small distribution. This gave creators tons of freedom to make comics about whatever they wanted and not have to worry about the Comics Code or censorship. One of the big players in the underground movement was Robert Crumb. Crumb made his breakthrough into the comics role with Zap Comics #1 in 1968, the first successful underground publication. The content of Zap was based on counterculture characters and movements. It also featured the first publication of Crumb's famous Keep On Trucking illustration, which would become widely pirated and Crumb would lose the rights to. Zap would pave the way for comics to be sold in alternate venues as head shops and eventually real comic book shops. Crumb himself would become widely known and synonymous with the underground movement, and would find some amount of mainstream success over the years. His work would be featured on album art for musical groups like Big Brother and the Holding Company, and an animated film based on his character Fritz the Cat, which he would personally end up denouncing and killing off Fritz in the comic as a result. There's also a documentary on his life. The underground comics movement would cause a huge stir. It's been said that between 1965 and 1975, that over 35,000 unique titles were published. The sheer energy and volume of the work produced during the underground movement gave great headway into creator-owned work, and making comics that they wanted to, not stifled by the code. The Undergrounds were the first major independent comic movement, and they set the trail for modern independent comic production. Self-publishing has become of huge importance to comics. It allows creators to tell the stories they want without having to rely on larger companies, and allows for more versatility in comics. And while I've spent most of this video talking about what's happened in America in comics, because an international reach of comics is just as important, I'd like to take a quick look at a very important creator from Japan. Manga has had a huge boom in America more recently, and people have become acquainted with Japanese comics in ways that they never were before. But the Japanese comics industry has been growing and thriving for almost as long as it has in America, and that's in no small part to Osamu Tezuka. Tezuka was a medical student who published his first work in 1946, The Diary of Machan, which was followed the next year by his comic New Treasure Island. While comics had been present in Japan prior to this, many people agree that this was the start of the golden age of manga. He would continue making comics through his graduation in med school in 1951 and beyond. He would never go into the medical practice professionally though. In 1952 he would create The Mighty Atom, who would become known internationally as Astro Boy. Astro Boy was hugely successful and became adapted into the first popular animated Japanese TV series, in a style that would eventually become known as anime. While interested in animation and comics, Tezuka had an amazing productivity to him. He created over 700 books and over 150,000 pages of comics over his lifetime. His characters would become iconic in Japan and successful worldwide. The work of Tezuka remains influential today and started the progression of modern comics in Japan. Well, that's all I have time for today. Like I said before, I wish there was a way to cover more about comics as a whole, but it's just such a large and expansive subject. I hope this video is giving you some insight to where comics came from and their potential for growth. I also just wanted to say thank you for watching. If you have any comic related thing you'd like to hear me talk about, just leave a comment below. This is the first of what I hope to be many videos looking into books, series, creators, companies, really anything related to comics I want to talk about. So I hope to see you again soon, and until next time, pick up a comic and give it a read.